In this video, we're going to bake a set of maps that we're going to use throughout the texturing process. So here I'm going to open my texture set settings, and I'm just going to undock this window here in the UI. Now you'll notice that I have my base texture set list selected, and here is these settings, and as we covered in the previous video, each texture set's going to have its own settings. Now here under Mesh Maps, you'll notice that we have this Bake Mesh Maps button. I'm going to click this, and it's going to open up the Baking dialog wizard. Now, for the map types, I am not going to be baking a normal map since we're using a high poly mesh in this course. Now here for the thickness, we're not going to bake this as well, so I'm going to disable those bakers. We're going to bake world space, normal, ID, ambient occlusion, curvature, and position. Now here we have this common parameters tab, and this is going to be, well, parameters that are common to all the bakers. What we're worried about here is our output size, so I'm going to set this to be 2048 by 2048. Now for this course, I'm pretty much going to leave everything at the default. However, we do need to make some setting changes here for our ID baker. So if I left click on the ID, you can see the UI now focuses to the ID baker parameters. And for color source, we need to change this from vertex color to material color. Now you'll also notice here that we have a drop down for texture set. And if I click this menu, again it shows all of the texture sets for my project. Since I've made a change here to base 1, which is this texture set that is selected when I open the baking dialog, we've only made our color source change for this texture set. However, I'd like to apply this to everything, all the texture sets in my project. So I'm just going to click the Apply to All button. So now my color source has been set to material color for all the texture sets. Now I'm going to click the Common button to roll back up to my common parameters, and I need to set a mesh here for this high definition mesh. Now, like I said, we're not using a low and a high. We're not baking a normal because in this project, we're using a high definition mesh. However, like I said, I'm going to be baking some IDs that I can use in the texturing process to quickly create masks based on an ID map. So to help with that process, I've created a second version of my lantern mesh that contains the material IDs that I want to use to bake this ID map. So what I'm going to do here for the high definition mesh, I'm going to click this browse button, and I'm going to choose here in my project files the lantern_ID FBX, and we'll open this. So here in this section, you can use the high definition mesh, well, for a high definition mesh if you're baking a normal, but in the case of IDs, whatever mesh is set here in this high definition meshes, it will be used in the ID bake as well. Okay, so now that we have this all set up, what I'm going to do now is click Bake All Texture Sets to batch process this baking. So here you can see that Painter's now going through the process of baking everything, and I'll just pause the video and we'll pick back up once all of the baking has completed. So here you can see that Painter has baked my maps, and the maps have been automatically placed here in the Mesh Map section for the texture set settings. Now here's our base. Let's go over here to this arm handle. Again, you can see a whole set of mesh maps have been placed here in this texture set as well. So now I'm just going to close my texture set settings. Now here in the UI at the top right, if we click this drop down, we can scroll down this menu and we can start to choose to take a look at these mesh maps. So if I choose world space normal, here I can see or visualize this world space normal for all of the texture sets. We also have a keyboard shortcut for this, so if you just use Shift+B, you can cycle through the maps here in the viewport. So again, I'll hit Shift-B, and you can see now I'm looking at the curvature, Shift-B, and here I have my ambient occlusion. To get back to my material view, I can use this drop down and just simply choose underneath lighting material, or I can just hit M on the keyboard to get back into material mode. So now I'm going to go and take a look at that ID map. So here I'll use the Shift-B keyboard shortcut, and you can see here that we're targeting the ID map. Now this ID map is a texture filled with solid colors, and each one of these colors is going to represent a material ID. And later in the course, we're going to be able to use these IDs to quickly create a mask. So now if I come back here into Maya and take a look at this ID mesh, you can see that I do have these materials which are represented by these solid colors. Here I have this yellow color here for the wire. So in our ID baker, when we set that source to material color, this is where that material color is coming from. Now back here in Painter, if I zoom in really close, we can start to see that we're getting a bit of a strange error. So let's take a look at this yellow ID, which represents these wires. Well, here I can see that this yellow color is being projected onto some of the other material colors. Here we can also see it where we have this yellow and it's projecting here onto this blue ID. Now this is going to cause us some trouble later when we go to use these IDs as a mask. So we want to be able to account for this problem, and we can do that in our baker. Typically what you would do in a baker would be to explode this mesh so that the mesh parts when baking do not cause projection errors when the ray is traced. However, here in Substance Painter, we can use a special feature to help us do that. So here, I'm going to come over to my texture set settings, and I'm going to click Bake Mesh Maps once again. Now, it doesn't matter which texture set I had selected because we're really going to be working on the common parameters here, which again are common to all of the bake parameters. So I'm just going to scroll down until I get to this section here called Match. And you can see that we have this drop down that says Always or By Mesh Name. So I'm going to select this By Mesh Name operation. And what this is going to allow me to do is use a high poly mesh suffix and a low poly mesh suffix to split my mesh into groups of similar names so that when the ray is traced, they only intersect with meshes that match that name. So for example, if I jump back here to Maya, we can see that I have the lantern and it's made up of these separate mesh parts, as you see here. So these meshes are divided. Now I've added a suffix to each one of these mesh names. So for example, we have base underscore ID. We have top underscore ID. So for this ID mesh, I've just chosen to use an ID suffix. Now here I've opened the lantern mesh. This is the mesh that we built our Substance Painter project from. And here you can see that we have the same mesh names. For example, we have base and we have top, except this time I've just chose to use a new suffix and I call this one, this is underscore main. So the suffix main has been placed for each one of these mesh part names. However, the first part of the name still matches the ID. So now, back here in Painter, what I'm going to do is change this high poly mesh suffix to match the suffix that I added in Maya. You can use any name you wanted. For example, I could have just used low and high for the default. I didn't do that because in this course, we're not really dealing with a high and a low res mesh. So for the high poly mesh, here in my case, this is just going to represent my IDs only. So I'm just going to give this the suffix of underscore ID. Let me go back here to my common parameters. And here for the low poly mesh, I'm going to use underscore main. So here you can see that I've set the suffix correctly. So now that I have this in place, here let me just uncheck all of these other bakers because all the other bakers are going to be fine. What I really want to do is just work with this ID map now. And so now I'm just going to click Bake All Texture Sets. So I'm going to rebake this ID map for all my texture sets, taking into consideration that the match setting is now going to be using match by mesh name with my suffixes underscore ID and underscore main. So now we'll click Bake All Texture Sets, and the new ID maps are going to be baked and just simply replaced here in my texture set settings. Okay, so Painter has finished the baking process, and so now I'm going to take a look at that material ID. So again, I'll hit Shift B on the keyboard to drop into my ID mode, as you can see here at the top of the UI. And if we zoom in, you can now see that that projection error that we were getting before, we used match by mesh name. So basically, we were not masking that ray trace in the bake at all. We were just letting it go for all the meshes. However, now using match by mesh name, we've isolated that ray trace to specific meshes with the same matching name based on those suffixes. And of course, this has solved that error that we were getting. Here, if we look over in this section as well, we're no longer getting that yellow ID reprojecting over here onto the blue ID. So now we have everything fixed and ready to go. So in this video, we've baked a set of maps for each one of our texture sets that we're going to use throughout our texturing process. We talked specifically about being able to bake an ID map where we use the match by mesh name feature to mask any ray projection issues we were getting from mesh parts that were close together, which would cause any of these ray projection issues. So now in the next video, we're going to get to the process of starting to create some materials.